I'd hope that just about everyone in this room would at least know that the World Wide Web was largely emerged from the efforts of a single person, Tim, now Sir Tim Berners-Lee. You don't have to win the Tour de France to get a knighthood, apparently, at CERN at the beginning of the 1990s, which for many of you in this room would seem like a lifetime ago. But for others, like me, far less so, the blink of an eye. But the web was by no means the first implementation of this idea we now call hypertext. Indeed, the idea of hypertext might be traced back as far as the Talmud, a central text of Judaism, as long ago as 2,000 years hence, when a single page might incorporate centuries of accumulated exegesis. And very unusually for the time, the text wasn't linear, it didn't follow a single idea, but rather intertwingled ideas from different generations and different centuries. If we move to the modern era, the Mandaneum is a building originally created over a century ago, which you can still visit today. And it's perhaps the first significant example of the idea of hypertext. Though, of course, from before a time of electronics and before even optical miniaturization, so at the scale of everyday human objects. Half a century after the Mandaneum, as the terrible Second World War drew to a close, Vannevar Bush imagined how we may think. And the Memex, a pre-electronic knowledge management desk that used optical miniaturization and mechanical automation to advance ideas that 20 years later, almost exactly 50 years ago today, were finally given the name hypertext by the legendary Ted Nelson of Xanadu fame, though not sadly the movie with Olivia Newton-John. Xanadu was perhaps the first and certainly the longest running and most audacious vaporware project in history. So, when in 1991, Tim Berners-Lee announced the World Wide Web project that he'd been working on for many years, the idea of hypertext was well established, and indeed, commercial systems like HyperCard and many others had been available for some cases for years. In fact, so established was the field that the Association for Computer Machinery had a large-scale conference focused specifically on hypertext, called in that year, very imaginatively, Hypertext 91. In 1991, when Tim Berners-Lee submitted a paper on his www project to this very conference, how was it received? You'd imagine it was considered the answer all researchers and hypertext developers and experts have been looking for. Surely it was recognised as the system to make hypertext mainstream and global. As it turns out, Tim Berners-Lee's paper on the World Wide Web project was rejected from that conference. He was, however, given the more lowly place and allowed to demonstrate his system at the conference, and here, in fact, is a photo of that occurring. But all was not lost. The conference, Hypertext 91, did feature such important contributions to the field of hypertext as screen management in hypertext systems with rubber sheet layouts. I'm not sure I want to think too much more about what a rubber sheet might be, but cascading style sheets sound much nicer. And SAL, a hypermedia system. But in all seriousness, how could this possibly be? How could experts in this field not have recognised the important breakthrough that was the World Wide Web? Well, let's try and get a sense of what was going wrong. Here's the anonymous thoughts of an hypertext expert critical of the www from this time. And here's what he had to say. Well, I'm assuming it's a he. I don't know that for certain because his name has been, or her name has been withheld from history. Links in hypertext must be bidirectional. The World Wide Webs are only one way. Servers aren't aware of each other and there is no inter-server communication. All www servers are equal. There should be a concept of hubs. www servers don't keep state. They are completely unaware of their previous interactions. This is one of my favourites. It's obvious that whoever wrote the hypertext engine doesn't understand HTML. This HTML is done all wrong. And this is the kicker. Finally, he's giving this away for free. That means it has no value at all. Right, this goes down with some of the very famous apocryphal or otherwise observations that the world will only need 6 computers and so forth. But this is how the World Wide Web project was received by experts in the field when it was announced, a bit over nearly 25 years ago now. So the specifics themselves don't matter all that much, although we'll return to a couple of them because there is some interest there. But what does matter to me is that the web didn't conform to the well-established hierarchies and closely held beliefs of hypertext experts at the time. And I'm going to make a confession. Experts like me, because yes, in the early 1990s, I was rather obsessed with hypertext. Around the time, I was building what became a commercial system for the Macintosh, a hypertext system that embodied many of those closely held beliefs about hypertext. For example, that links were bidirectional in my system. Now, as it turns out, Tim Berners-Lee's actually developed a hypertext system before the World Wide Web. It was called Enquire. And interestingly enough, in Enquire, links were bidirectional. So it wasn't just ignorance and naivety that led to the design decisions that Tim Berners-Lee made about the web. They came informed by his own many-year experience. But I must admit, like probably most hypertext experts at the time, I definitely felt the web was underpowered. It was anemic and couldn't possibly survive in the long term. It would be replaced by something that more closely adhered to these well-established hierarchies that we all knew were what hypertext was really about. But curiously, it turns out that being worse isn't always the impediment for a new technology we might intuitively think it is. Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma makes the case that disruptive technologies don't start out better than established technologies, as would seem intuitive. They start out worse. But for all their faults in comparison with their entrenched, established competitors, there's something radically different about them that opens whole new opportunities and makes them, in that now chronically over and misused term, disruptive. If you want to blame someone for the term, by the way, it's Christensen who coined it in this sense. So what was this difference upon which the web and the success of the web rested? What radically different thing did the web enable? For one, to me, and crucially, it was the web's simplicity. Bidirectional links, hub servers, stateful servers, all these would have added huge complexity to the web. They would have required closely coupled systems and the coordination of resources across teams and entities to get anything up and running. In an era when computing was essentially hugely expensive and massively centralised in governments and universities and enterprises, this closely held belief about what computing was made perfect sense. But it severely limited what networking technologies could ultimately possibly do. And more importantly, who was able to build and participate in such systems. On the contrary, the web's simplicity meant competent programmers could build a basic HTTP server or a browser in a matter of days, and doing so required no permission or licensing or complex integration with other systems. For authors, rather than complex and unforgiving SGML, the done all wrong version, HTML, could be picked up in a matter of an hour or two. I'm sure some of us in this room actually did build their first web pages in that time frame. Its simplicity, its lack of any styling, its lack of inline images, let alone any interactivity or scripting, while weaknesses also made developing browsers really straightforward. And very much not least, Tim Berners-Lee was, as we saw, giving it away. As he himself observed, had the technology been proprietary, and in my total control, it would probably not have taken off. You can't propose that something be a universal space and at the same time keep control of it. Which more than a little reminds me again of the Dao De Jing, which we're going to return to a few times over the next half an hour or so, because as Oliver mentioned, probably the only reason I'm standing on your stage is I wrote an essay about 15 years ago that looked at the principles of the Dao De Jing and how they applied to the web, and I keep coming back to that idea. In the Dao De Jing, in chapter 2, right at the beginning, we find this idea of the master. And the master helps people lose everything they know, everything they desire, and creates confusion in those who think they know. Now, all of this may look like a happy accident, but it's important to observe that at that time of rampant commercialisation of computer technology, where companies paid hundreds of dollars annually per seat to companies like Novell to network their computers, and in today's terms, many multiples of what we pay for hardware and software, the principles underlying the web were radical, and I'd strongly argue significantly responsible for its success. Later, Tim Berners-Lee articulated these values and these principles, and I think it's worth having a quick look at them, because the web wasn't accidental, and it wasn't just built as an idea around technology, it was built as an idea around principles and values. And I think at times when we get a little lost with the web and we worry about its future, it's worth returning to these values, because I think it underlies pretty much all the decisions we should make about what we do with the web. The first of these was decentralisation. So there was no permission needed from a central authority to post anything on the web. There's no central controlling node and no single point of failure and no kill switch. This also implies freedom from indiscriminate censorship and surveillance. Non-discrimination. If I pay to connect to the internet with a certain quality of service and you pay to connect with that or higher quality of service, then we can both communicate at the same level. And this is the principle of net neutrality. Bottom-up design. Instead of code being written and controlled by a small group of experts, it was developed in full view of everyone, encouraging maximum participation and experimentation. Universality, for anyone to be able to publish anything on the web, all computers involved have to speak the same language to each other, no matter what different hardware people are using, where they live or what cultural and political beliefs they have. In this way, the web breaks down silos while still allowing diversity to flourish. And lastly, consensus. For universal standards to work, everyone had to agree to use them. But it is worth noting that these principles underline the way in which the World Wide Web was developed. And I think the success of the web, which, let's face it, a quarter of a century is a very long time frame for a technology to grow and survive and flourish. Think of all the technologies that were dominant in the early 1990s and how many are left now. Very, very few. But the web is still there, and I think for no small part because of these principles. And so, with this foundation, a period of extraordinary growth of the adoption and commercialisation of the web in the middle 1990s started. At the time, the almost anarchic nature of the web both led to its growth, but also seemed to be the greatest threat to its survival. Netscape, the first successful commercial browser, drove the innovation of web technologies, introducing inline images, the font tag, both of which Tim Berners-Lee actively hated but didn't step in the way of being implemented. Frames and other novel features of HTML that other browsers scrambled then to reverse engineer and implement. But this innovation was chaotic and poorly thought through and threatened many of the web's underlying principles and the web itself in many ways, as some of you old enough to have been there will remember. And when Microsoft got into the act with Internet Explorer, we saw two browsers from two incredibly well-resourced companies competing through the innovation of the web platform, but each in their own way, thus threatening the web's existence as an open, interconnected ecosystem, threatening those core values that we just saw. Fortunately, for reasons in part still hard to fathom, perhaps a jiu-jitsu move by the still uncharacteristically underdog Microsoft, perhaps a purely happy accident, some sense prevailed with the formation of the World Wide Web Consortium at precisely, or perhaps exactly the right time. As a sort of honest broker, where fierce rivals like Netscape and Microsoft could thrash out agreements as to web standards, rather than simply do that in the arena of new browser releases. Which all led to the commercial growth of the web. And as the web became more widely adopted and commercialised, for the first time it drew visual communicators, until then largely absent from the medium. And mostly these came from the tradition of print design. At the time, purely digital graphic design was very much in its infancy, and tools like Photoshop and PageMaker were designed with the print rather than digital media in mind. Computers were, in most people's minds at the time, still tools for creating content. They were very expensive and they had to pay their way. They weren't tools for consuming content, as they have become for the most part today. And it was in this context the first sophisticated attempts to create page layouts and designs for the web emerged, exemplified perhaps by the #1 selling book on Amazon in 1996. And this is of any book on anything. It was called Creating Killer Websites. And killer websites advance techniques that your grandparents may have told you about, including rendering some of all of a page's text as an image, which interestingly is something that lived on until only a few years ago with the rise of font embedding. I'm pretty sure almost everyone in this room used image replacement techniques, but where they originally came from was that book. And what we all sneer at now, tables for pixel perfect layout, again, was basically popularized by this book, as well as a whole range of other completely horrible techniques that you probably haven't even seen, but which were very popular and which basically were the standard tool in trade of a web designer in about 1997, 98. So why was that? Well, at the time, designers saw the screen and the web as basically a lower resolution, broken, worse version of paper, and railed against such absurdities as the difference in effective dots per inch between the Mac and Windows, the different system fonts available on each of these platforms, the moving target at different screen sizes. We had to deal with a terrible range from all the way from 640 by 480 all the way up to 1040 by 768. But at the time, this was considered this enormous landscape that was almost impossible to design around. Not to mention the different colour palettes that Netscape and Internet Explorer had, meaning that there are only a limited number of web-safe colours. Seriously, for quite a few years there, this is mostly the sort of thing we worried about. Basically how to turn the web back into a piece of paper that we were comfortable with. So we spent the best part of half a decade trying to fix CSS and trying to fix, literally as in make it unchanging across different devices, the web, to give designers the control they readily had with paper, where all the characteristics of the medium are fixed in advance and knowable and controllable. We tried to make the web what you see is what you get, which of course was the future because we'd just seen printing move to that WYSIWYG model. Now, someone whose name until now has been left out of this story, but who might readily have turned up long ago, is Douglas Engelbart. Amongst other things, he invented video conferencing and the mouse. And he made the observation that what you see is what you get isn't really what you see is what you get, it's what you see is all you get. Because we make compromises when we choose the convenience and the easiness of WYSIWYG. And these are compromises that work really well in a paper-based world where the possibilities of the medium, the paper size, the colour, the output resolution, are highly constrained. But the same compromises worked less well in a networked world of a multitude of devices. For years, we saw this fluidity, this lack of a fixed output surface of the web as a limitation, a bug to be eliminated. In early 2000s, I brought together a lot of ideas in an essay to which I'm referring quite a few times today, A Tao of Web Design. The ideas in it were far from exclusively mine, but rather it seemed that at the right time, I synthesised what many of us had been thinking about and talking about and doing with the web. How perhaps these supposed bugs of the web weren't really bugs after all, but features of a new medium that looked and felt like print, only worse. Features that we needed to understand and embrace and explore to really help create that new medium. Now, in many ways, these criticisms of the web by print designers, its low resolution, its fragmented screen sizes, radically different colour gamuts across devices, poor font options, these were all very legitimate, but they also miss the point. Screens aren't paper. They have their own strengths, particularly when they're networked and, as we imagined then, but which only really came later, when they're mobile. You see, while network screens, while worse from a print design perspective, also support animation, which, funnily enough, we've only really started to embrace now in any meaningful way a decade or more later, as well as sound and video. They decrease the time to access information and potentially the cost and certainly the effort as compared with paper dramatically. They allow documents that are searchable and indexable, that you can link together and annotate. And, as we observed at the time, they allow content to, in what we now call responsive design, respond to a myriad of devices and use contexts, none of which paper can do. The web of the early 1990s, as we saw, was initially considered an underpowered, worse version of hypertext, except as it turns out, its limitations were also its strengths, what made it radically different. And then a decade later, in relation to print as a medium, we see the same pattern emerge. Perhaps there's something going on here. After the frenetic browser wars of the second half of the 1990s, things settled down somewhat. An uneasy truce between Netscape and Microsoft saw the rise of a standards-based web, and there's a long and important story to tell here too, which we don't really have time for today, of a band of, well, let's put it frankly, deluded people, including my good friend and later speaker at this conference, Eric Meyer, who somehow, lacking any real standing or importance in the technology industry, managed, I really still can't work out how, to convince ultimately the entire industry to fly in the face of the proprietary, monolithic, siloed, winner-takes-all economics of IT that had prevailed for decades, since IBM wouldn't even sell you, only lease you a mainframe computer. Convincing browser manufacturers, including the near-then dominant Microsoft, as well as everyday web developers, to adopt what was then a radically newer standards-based approach to developing for the web. It's a miracle. Netscape in this period fell away, and by around 2003, Internet Explorer for Windows was more or less the only game in town. Now, it's become commonplace to decry IE6 for Windows and the long stasis that followed its release, and much of that is fair enough. But we are fortunate that it was as good as it was and supported techniques like doc-type switching that allowed us to develop standards-based websites at all. And once again, it was the underlying principles of the web we saw earlier that saved it from the moribund state it had reached in 2004. While the Mac as a platform had dropped to low single digits in terms of its user base, it had retained an influential user base of designers and then with the rise of OS X developers. And with Safari and almost simultaneously Firefox, which rose from the ashes of Netscape's open sourcing of its browser some years before, for the first time in several years, we saw the arrival of new web browsers. Indeed, of any new web features at all. Hard as it is to believe in this era of monthly new releases of Chrome and Firefox and even frequent updates of Internet Explorer. Now, compare this resurgence of the web with the attempts at the same time to develop apps which competed with Microsoft's dominant Office franchise, where interoperability was more or less impossible due to the proprietary, undocumented, and often changing, hideously complex Office file formats, which at times even Microsoft struggled to maintain compatibility with across versions of their own software. The web, fortunately, didn't have this lock-in by principle and by design, thanks, as I said, to the openness, that principle of openness, its relative simplicity, its royalty-free nature, and the efforts of the folks to bring about a standards-based approach to development. And while Microsoft had more or less abandoned the web with IE6 for several years, the web platform still survived and in time grew again, but that wasn't an accident. And then the moment we'd seen almost a decade before, the arrival of a genuinely usable mobile web with the original iPhone in 2007. It was a great day for the web and for those who'd advocated a standards-based, responsive approach to development. The term, of course, came 3 years later in 2010, but we'd talked about that idea way back in 2000. In A Day of Web Design, I gave that general idea that became responsive design the term adaptive web design. But the masses of developers clamoured for native, not web apps, for the iPhone that Jobs and Apple had originally touted as the way to develop for their new device. And so began the most recent and in many ways most challenging era of the web, the age of apps. But before we turn that page, it's important to observe just how central to the success of the iPhone the web was. The web was the only way that apps, outside of Apple's own themselves, could be developed for the platform. And it became, I'd argue, the iPhone's instant point of differentiation. Despite it being a slower device, in terms of networks, it was 2G only in an era when 3G was almost de rigueur, and CPUs. despite it being, in Christensen's terms, in many ways a worse device than the then dominant BlackBerrys and Microsoft and Nokia devices of the time. All of those companies laughed at the iPhone when it was launched. And we look back in time and we can wonder how foolish they were, but they were playing a different game. They were looking at the specs of the device. And the web and the iPhone was massively under-specced by the standards of the day. But what it had that no device before it ever had was a usable mobile web. I'd argue the web, as much as, even more than multi-touch, was the iPhone's key differentiator when it was launched. Seriously, imagine the original iPhone without the web. I doubt that it would have been the success that it is today. But for those of us who'd advocated that the web was the way to build for every device, things turned out a little differently than it appeared in early 2007. With the rise of native apps, the web faced and perhaps continues to face its greatest challenge since it began over 2 decades ago. Now, the concern for the web, both within and outside the community of web professionals, is above all that the technologies of the web are lagging behind that of native platforms, that it is a worse platform. By way of example, we've seen in recent months Flipboard build an entire pseudo-DOM and render to canvas instead of the browser's own DOM because you can't build a 60 frame per second scrolling list view with the DOM, unquote. So apparently it makes sense to throw out all the browser's goodness, all of the hundreds or thousands of person-years effort that have gone into browsers and to standards to ensure we get jank-free scrolling on the latest, greatest mobile devices, that is, forget the rest of the web devices. Now, does this sound a bit familiar to you? It's interesting too how this goal of pixel-perfect layouts is touted as an important reason for Flipboard's approach. The term pixel-perfect layout, which I'm sure we've all heard, might not have been invented by killer websites, then again it's entirely possible that it was, but it was certainly popularised in that book. I honestly thought it was a phrase only used ironically these days. Perhaps this is a subtle hint that Flipboard's actually trolling us, but somehow I don't think they are. And lastly, I want to observe about this little episode, somewhat lost in this conversation is the fact that Flipboard thought, I mean, let's face it, they're tremendously successful with solely native devices. And they thought it was important to bring their app to the web at all is a really interesting thing to observe. And of course, there's an entire cottage industry of folks making observations like, apps aren't really in opposition to the open internet, they're just superior clients to open internet services. And going so far as to describe Flipboard's, let's face it, unbelievable overkill of re-implementing a sizable subset of the entire browser stack to basically get jank-free list scrolling in the latest devices, forget the rest of them where it won't work at all, a scathing combination of DOM, CSS, web standard stack. Now, underneath these criticisms is always the assumption that somehow by their very nature, native apps are superior to browser-based apps. It's rather hard to pin down such advocates exactly as to why. But you know what? Maybe these people are right. Because what's our response as web designers and developers been to all this? Above all, we accept the premise that what the web should do is acknowledge its inferiority and compete with apps on their own terms. But our look at the history of the web this morning has a suggestion for us, I'd argue. And I think that lesson is that we shouldn't give in to this app envy and continue to wish we had features that ape native platforms. Just as in hindsight, hypertext envy and print envy were misguided. In 1991, should Tim Berners-Lee have taken his worst hypertext, added bidirectional links, centralized servers, and so on and on? That's exactly what Sal did. I don't know. Ironically, the only way you can get the proceedings of Hypertext 91 is to pay a very large amount of money for them. Thank God Tim Berners-Lee embraced his worst version of hypertext. And what if we'd envied print? Well, indeed we did. We spent a decade trying to use image replacement techniques and all sorts of techniques to overcome the limitations of the medium that print designers lamented. Indeed, Adobe Acrobat 3 in the late 90s allowed PDF documents to be served on a per-page basis, effectively making a PDF a website. Turns out people really didn't care that much about the web not being like the printed page. Well, not as much as all the other things that this worse medium had to offer. Ironically, John Gruber almost gets it right. This is actually from only yesterday. The reason the web won in the late 90s, whereby won I mean became the dominant platform of software development, that sounds like winning to me, wasn't because web apps were native-like. Correct, Mr. Gruber. Quite the opposite. The web became dominant despite the fact the apps were rather crude from a UI perspective. Again, correct, but again, well, why were they successful despite these things? And then he adds, because he has to, the solution is for the entire browser web development community to get it through their, that means our heads, that the web will never out-native actual native apps. But you know what? John Gruber is, in some ways here, right. Many of us do continue to invest enormously in our app envy. Reinventing the DOM to support some snazzy controls that would otherwise be janky, like janky scrolling is the worst thing ever. Instead, perhaps, of embracing the reality that the effort to do this comes at the cost of making the things we build vastly more complex and difficult to build and maintain, and even to learn to develop for in the first place. We seem to be forgetting those underlying principles and values of the web. And I don't know about you, but to me this sounds a lot like those responses to the web at hypertext 91 or the response of print designers in the late 1990s. When will we learn that the web isn't a version of something else, hypertext or print or app platform or OS, as much as it may seem to resemble these things? It's a worse and radically different thing. Perhaps we should by now have learned to embrace what the web does best and the values of the web, to build not what's common and popular now, what looks and feels most like the past, our closely held beliefs, but what comes next. So, what does come next? And this, dear listener, is where I must leave you. I'm not a futurist, despite my 2-year-old's best attempts at hairstyling. I look nothing like Shingy, who gets paid enormous amounts of money to think about the future. I tend to more side with Alan Kay and observe that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. But I do know the web's future will be built on the principles and spirit of the web, not on the web growing up and competing with native platforms better, any more than it needed to grow up and be more like what we thought hypertext should be, or more like prints. Because while it's often worse, it is different. And as we've seen time and again, that's not a bad thing. Making the web adhere to the closely held beliefs about hypertext in 91 would have been its end before it even began. It would have been consigned to the same scrap heap as Sal and all the other systems I'm sure that were demoed at hypertext 91, because it would have been backwards looking, not looking to the future. Making the web more like print, something we spent so much time trying to do in the late 90s and early 2000s, was backward looking. The future looked worse, but different. But without abandoning those ideas, there could have been no responsive web design. And now today, wishing the web could better compete with native platforms is, I'd argue, backwards looking. Yes, the web is worse, but hopefully now you'll have the confidence to not just know, but believe that's not a bad thing. The future starts by being worse, and that's okay. A little more bluntly, someone whose ideas and efforts over decades I continue to admire hugely, Scott Jensen, recently quoting Thomas Edison, observed, "Vision without execution is hallucination." Jensen, in this recent, rather challenging essay, Vision Without Execution, also cites Martin Luther King. The difference between a dreamer and a visionary is that the visionary has his eyes open. Jensen concludes the essay, you should go and find it. My plea is simple. Let's stop predicting the future and start building it How we understand technology beyond a trivial demo is the much harder problem to solve, and there are no simple tricks. It's hard, dogged work. So before we jump too far into the future, let's keep our eyes open, build something, anything, and discuss what we learn. Dare to be wrong, rejoice and share when it works. That's how sufficiently advanced technology gets built, one stubbornly obvious step at a time. The next 2 days, we'll be hearing from many wonderful folk who I admire greatly, who are doing that hard, dogged work across a range of disciplines and technologies. They're inventing the future, they're building things and discussing what they learned. Folks like Eric Meyer, to whom we all on the web owe an enormous debt of gratitude, and Rachel Andrew and Sarah Sweden, and a whole raft more. I hope, like me, you can't wait to hear from them. And in sharing courageously what they've learned, they're emphasising one final and I think probably ultimate principle of the web, perhaps its greatest, that keeps me such an advocate for and believer in it, the principle of generosity. In the hands of people like these, and you all here, I think the web's going to be just fine. Thank you very much.